Isn't it strange that we speak so freely to God, yet so rarely stop to think about what we are doing? Suppose you were granted an audience with the king of a great land, a ruler whose mere glance could unmake you. Would you not tremble before stepping into his hall? Would you not weigh your words carefully, knowing that each syllable might matter? And yet, how casually we stumble into prayer, as though speaking to some vague and distant mist rather than the one who formed the stars and calls each by name. Before we utter a single word, before we even bend the knee or bow the head, something must happen first. We must wake up to the reality of whom we are addressing, for prayer is not an exercise in wish-making, nor is it a mere mental habit. It is an encounter with the living God. If we do not begin with this awareness, we do not truly pray at all. We merely mumble into the void, mistaking our own echoes for divine communion. Too often prayer is undertaken as if it were an obligation rather than an invitation. We reel off words with the same thoughtless efficiency as one signing their name to a document they have not read. But should we not first still our racing thoughts? Should we not prepare the heart before we speak? For a mind untamed is a poor instrument for communion with the divine. We rush in, listing our grievances and requests, and then we wonder why heaven seems silent. But tell me, how often have you waited to hear if heaven had anything to say in return? If prayer is to be real, it must begin with honesty, not the honesty of well-rehearsed confessions, but the kind that strips away all pretense. You cannot deceive the one who knows your inmost being. If you are dry, say so. If you are weary, admit it. If you are reluctant to pray at all, confess that too. Do you imagine that God is more pleased with a cold recitation than with a trembling but truthful whisper? And what of the words themselves? Let us not mistake prayer for a mere collection of phrases. A child may learn to repeat words before he understands their meaning, but a grown man who prays in the same way is merely performing a religious duty rather than conversing with God. The power of prayer does not reside in its eloquence, but in its sincerity. One honest plea, "Lord, have mercy on me," is of greater worth than 1,000 empty repetitions. Another danger lurks in prayer, and it is this, that we enter it with the belief that it is meant to bring God into alignment with our will, rather than to align ourselves with His. We sit in the presence of the Almighty and behave as if He were our servant, as though our chief business were to persuade Him to see reason. But He is not the one who must change. We are. To pray rightly, we must be prepared to lay down our own stubborn desires and say, even if our lips tremble as we say it, "Not my will, but yours be done." And then there is silence. We do not cherish it as we should. We are so quick to speak, so slow to listen. Yet it is in stillness that we hear most clearly. A heart that is cluttered with noise cannot receive what God longs to give. Before we begin to pray, we must first quiet ourselves to make space for the whisper that so often goes unheard. But most of all, before we pray, we must be ready for the thing we least expect: obedience. It is easy to pray when we do not anticipate an answer that will require something of us. But real prayer always carries the risk of a command. And when that moment comes, when the whisper speaks, when the stillness delivers an answer, will we rise and follow, or will we pretend we did not hear? So, do not begin to pray until you have done this first. Wake up, be still, be honest, and be ready. For you do not stand before a shadow, nor do you speak into the air. You stand before the King, and He listens. Isn't it strange how easily we slip into the habit of saying words without truly thinking about them? We are creatures of routine, and nowhere is this more evident than in the way we pray. It is one thing to say a prayer, it is quite another to pray. The former is a habit, the latter an act of the soul reaching toward its Maker. But how often do we pause to consider the difference? How often do we stop and ask whether what we are doing is real communion with God, or merely an exercise in self-deception? There is a danger in mindless prayer, though it is rarely spoken of. It is the danger of treating prayer as a mechanical duty, something to be done merely because we feel we ought to do it. A man may bow his head, close his eyes, and utter words, perhaps beautiful words, perhaps words he has repeated every morning for years, and yet never truly pray at all. For it is possible to say prayers while the mind wanders in 1,000 directions. It is possible to kneel with a posture of reverence while the heart remains utterly untouched. The lips move, the voice sounds, but the soul is absent. And surely this is the strangest of all human habits, to go through the motions of speaking to God while scarcely remembering that He is there. The tragedy is not merely that such prayers are ineffective, but we wonder why our prayers seem powerless, why they do not bring comfort, clarity, or change. And yet, how can we expect to receive when we have not truly asked? How can we expect to hear when we have not truly spoken? A man who knocks upon a door while walking away cannot complain that no one answered. Yet this is precisely what we do when we approach God with distracted minds and half-hearted words. Some will say that the habit of prayer is a good thing, even if one does not always feel its weight. And there is truth in that. A man who waits until he is in the mood to pray may never pray at all. But there is a vast difference between persevering in prayer despite dryness and treating prayer as a duty to be rushed through. If a man only prays because he feels he must, like a child forced to write thank you notes for gifts he does not truly appreciate, then his prayers will be little more than empty words. And what, after all, is the purpose of prayer? Is it not to draw near to the one who made us? If so, then what good is a prayer that never truly reaches him? The solution is not to abandon the practice of prayer, but to recover its meaning. A man who finds himself repeating words without thought should not conclude that prayer itself is worthless, any more than a man who reads without comprehension should conclude that books are useless. The problem is not with prayer itself, but with the way we approach it. And the first step in remedying this is to recognize the weight of what we are doing. Consider for a moment what prayer truly is. It is not the speaking of words into the air. It is not a ritual to be performed, nor is it a means of ensuring that we have done our religious duty for the day. It is an audience with the King of Heaven. It is stepping into the presence of the one who holds the universe in his hands. And if we truly grasped this, if we truly understood the reality of whom we are addressing, would we not tremble before we spoke? Would we not take care to ensure that our words were not mere noise, but the genuine outpouring of our hearts? A man who enters a king's court does not speak thoughtlessly. He does not throw words into the air, hoping some of them will be received. He chooses his words with care, knowing that they are heard. And yet we do not do this when we pray. We speak without thinking, without preparing our hearts, without pausing to remember that we are addressing the Almighty. We do not even stop to ask ourselves whether we mean what we are saying. And what is the result? Prayer becomes, for many, a lifeless routine rather than a living encounter. The man who prays out of habit but without heart will find little joy in it. He will wonder why it feels empty, why it does not seem to change him. But how could it be otherwise? If a man speaks to his friend but never listens to the response, will he not eventually feel as though he is speaking to no one at all? If he repeats the same words every day without ever considering their meaning, will they not become meaningless to him? There is a reason why Christ warned against vain repetitions. It is not that repeated prayers are inherently wrong. After all, a child often says the same things to his father, and this is no fault, but that words, when spoken without thought, become hollow. And hollow prayers, no matter how often they are uttered, do not bring one closer to God. But what then should one do? If the danger of mindless prayer is real, how does one guard against it? The answer is not complex, though it requires effort. Before one begins to pray, one must first wake up. Wake up to the reality of whom you are speaking to. Wake up to the weight of your words. Wake up to the fact that you are not performing a religious duty, but entering into a conversation with the living God. Take a moment to still yourself, to remember where you are, to let the knowledge of His presence sink in. Do not let the habit of prayer rob you of its wonder. For prayer, when it is real, is one of the greatest privileges given to man. To speak with God, to bring before Him our needs, our fears, our desires, and our worship, is no small thing. But we must not treat it as small. If we do, we will find that we have not been praying at all, only speaking words into the silence. And that is not what we were made for. We were made for communion with God. And if we would truly pray, then we must first wake up to what prayer really is. When a man begins to pray, he often does so with little thought of whom he is addressing. He bows his head, folds his hands, and launches into words as if speaking into the air, as if prayer were nothing more than an exercise of the mind. Yet, if he were to stop for a moment and consider, truly consider, who stands before him, his words might come more slowly, and his heart might tremble before he dares to speak at all. Imagine for a moment that you were to enter the throne room of a great king, a sovereign whose power stretches over lands and peoples beyond your comprehension. You would not stroll in casually, muttering half-formed requests as you fumbled with your coat. You would not address him absent-mindedly, thinking of your own affairs while standing in his presence. No, you would be still. You would weigh your words. You would recognize the significance of the moment and the dignity of the one before whom you stood. And yet, when we pray, do we not often do the very opposite? Do we not rush in, half aware, throwing words before us as though it were God's duty to catch them? There is a great mistake in praying without first remembering who it is that we speak to. And it is not only a mistake, it is a kind of foolishness. It is one thing to forget a name in conversation, to fumble in our speech before a fellow man, to speak too quickly or thoughtlessly when distracted. These are small errors, forgivable and easily overlooked. But to forget God in the very act of speaking to Him is something far more serious. It is, in essence, to treat Him as though He were not there at all. We are too accustomed to our own words. We have repeated certain prayers so often that they no longer strike us with any weight. We have spoken of God's majesty so frequently that we have forgotten what majesty is. But to approach God in prayer without first awakening the soul to the reality of His presence is as absurd as a man who writes letters but never sends them, as meaningless as addressing a crowd that does not exist. A prayer spoken without awareness of God is no prayer at all. It is an exercise of the tongue, not of the heart. The prophets of old, when they encountered God, did not speak quickly. They did not reel off lists of requests or throw words into the air without thought. They fell on their faces. They trembled. Some were struck dumb, others wept. And why? Because they saw with terrifying clarity who He is and who they were in comparison. The modern mind, so confident, so accustomed to treating the divine as an object of study rather than the source of all being, has lost this sense of holy fear. We have domesticated God, made Him small in our thoughts, and so we treat prayer as something ordinary. But it is not ordinary. It is not small. Consider the weight of it. If God is who He says He is, if He is the one who spoke the universe into being, who holds the stars in their place, who knows the deepest thoughts of your heart, then how can prayer be a casual thing? How can it be rushed through, tossed out in hurried whispers before a meal, or mumbled before sleep overtakes us? To speak to God, the living God, is an act of staggering significance. And yet, how little we prepare for it. We would not address an earthly ruler with such carelessness, and yet we address the King of Heaven with less thought than we give to a passing conversation with a stranger. If we wish to pray rightly, we must begin by remembering. We must remember that we do not speak into empty space. We do not send words into the wind. We are heard. Every word, every sigh, every unspoken thought is known before it even leaves our lips. There is no such thing as a forgotten prayer. There is no such thing as a word wasted before God. And yet, this very truth should make us tremble. For if our words are heard, if they truly reach the ears of the Almighty, should we not be careful in how we speak? Should we not pause before we pray, gathering the heart, readying the mind and setting aside distractions so that our words may not be merely spoken but meant? Some may say that God knows our hearts already, that He does not require formality, that He welcomes the stumbling words of His children as a father welcomes the eager but inarticulate speech of his son. And this is true. He does not demand eloquence, nor does He turn away the simplest cry for help. But to say that He understands our weakness is not to excuse carelessness. A child who runs eagerly into his father's arms is not the same as a servant who enters his master's hall without thought or reverence. And we are not merely children. We are also servants, subjects, created beings standing before our Creator. The beginning of all true prayer is awareness. Before we speak, before we even shape our thoughts into words, we must pause and remember who it is that we approach. We must wake up to the reality of His presence, shake off the fog of routine, and remind ourselves that prayer is not an obligation, but an encounter. If we would do this, if we would train our minds and hearts to first consider the one to whom we pray, then even the simplest prayers would be transformed. A single whispered, "Lord, have mercy," spoken with true awareness, is worth more than 1,000 lofty prayers spoken without thought. For prayer is not about words alone. It is about the soul meeting God. And if we forget who He is, if we forget His holiness, His power, His nearness, then we do not truly pray at all. We only speak into the air, deceiving ourselves into thinking that we have prayed, when in truth we have only spoken. But if we remember, if we begin each prayer with the full knowledge that we stand before the Almighty, then every word, no matter how small, will carry the weight of eternity. It is a peculiar thing that men, when they think of prayer, so often concern themselves with the outward form, and so little with the state of the heart. They will speak of the proper way to kneel, the right words to say, the manner in which the hands should be folded, as though God, like some earthly magistrate, were more interested in the decorum of a petitioner than in the substance of his request. But one must ask, if the posture of the body is correct and the words well chosen, yet the heart remains cold, distracted, or indifferent, has prayer truly taken place at all? The simple truth, and one that we are reluctant to face, is that prayer is not a matter of outward motions, but of inward reality. A man may stand in a cathedral, his voice rising with reverent tones, and yet his heart may be far from the one to whom he speaks. Another may be kneeling in a darkened room, saying nothing at all, and yet his soul may be wholly engaged in the presence of his Maker. If we wish to pray rightly, then we must concern ourselves not first with the form, but with the posture of the heart. There is a certain danger in familiarity. What is often repeated loses its weight, not because it is untrue, but because we cease to feel it. A child who first learns to say "thank you" does so with meaning, for he has just discovered gratitude. But a man who has said it 1,000 times, often without thought, may mutter it as a reflex rather than a sincere response. And so it is with prayer. Many will pray daily, some even for years, yet never stop to ask whether their hearts are truly engaged. They will go through the motions, not realizing that they have substituted the habit of prayer for prayer itself. One need only consider how quickly the mind wanders in prayer to see how easily the heart departs from it. A man may begin in earnest, yet within moments his thoughts drift to the worries of the day, the tasks awaiting him, or some idle concern that has no place in the presence of God. And yet, rather than stopping, rather than collecting his thoughts and returning with renewed sincerity, he presses on, as though the mere completion of the words were the thing that mattered. He mistakes motion for meaning, as though God were more impressed by his persistence in speaking than by his attention to what is being spoken. This is not to say that distractions will not come. They will. But the difference between the one who truly prays and the one who merely says prayers is that the former will recognize when his heart has wandered and will bring it back, while the latter will allow his lips to continue moving even when his mind and soul have gone elsewhere. One may say that this is inevitable, that no man can ever maintain perfect concentration in prayer. Perhaps, but what matters is not whether distraction comes, but what we do when we notice it. Do we persist in an empty recital, or do we stop and remember why we began praying in the first place? It is no new thing that men should honor God with their lips, while their hearts are far from him. This was spoken of long ago, and it remains just as true today. A man may be deeply religious in all outward forms, attending services, reciting prayers, and following rituals, yet never once in all his life truly approach God. It is not the act of prayer itself that matters, but whether the heart is present in it. For if God is real, if he is who he says he is, then what could be more absurd than speaking to him without meaning it? To recite words to the one who knows all things, yet without sincerity, is not only foolish, but a kind of... There is an unsettling truth in this, for it forces us to examine ourselves in ways we may prefer to avoid. It is easy enough to go through the motions of prayer without ever questioning whether we are truly praying. But the man who stops to ask, "Do I mean what I am saying? Is my heart engaged, or am I merely reciting words?" may find that his prayers, though frequent, have been empty. And to realize this is uncomfortable, yet it is far better to see this truth now than to continue deceiving oneself with the appearance of devotion while the soul remains unmoved. If we are to pray rightly, We must begin by setting aside all pretense. It is useless to approach God with formal words if the heart is cold. Better to say a single honest sentence than to recite 1,000 empty phrases. And if the heart is not in a state to pray, if distractions pull it away or apathy has dulled it, then let the first prayer be simply this: Lord, awaken my heart. For he is not interested in empty speech. He desires truth in the inmost being. And if prayer is to be anything at all, it must begin with that truth. A man who understands this will not pray lightly. He will not rush into words thoughtlessly, nor will he continue speaking when he knows his heart is not engaged. He will approach prayer with the reverence it deserves, knowing that he stands before the One who sees all, including the hidden state of his soul. And knowing this, he will not seek merely to say prayers, but to pray, to truly lift his heart, his mind, his whole being before God, holding nothing back, hiding nothing, and speaking not because it is required of him, but because his soul knows it must. For the posture of the body may deceive others, and the words of the mouth may deceive even ourselves, but the posture of the heart cannot deceive God. And if we would truly pray, then we must begin by ensuring that it is rightly set before him. Is it not strange how quickly we become masters of disguising ourselves, even from ourselves? A man may deceive his neighbor, he may even deceive his closest friends, but there is no deception quite as tragic as the one he performs upon his own soul, and nowhere is this more evident than in the matter of prayer. For prayer, when it is real, is the most honest thing a man can do. It is the laying bare of the soul before the one who already knows it. And yet how often do men enter into it with a heart that is anything but honest? They come with rehearsed words, with postures of reverence, with all the outward trappings of devotion, yet inwardly they have not removed the mask. They speak not as they truly are, but as they wish to be seen, even when there is no audience but God himself. There is a deep instinct in man to present himself in the best possible light. He does it in his dealings with others, and he does it even when he is alone. He will justify his failings, excuse his weaknesses, and find elaborate reasons for his shortcomings, all so that he need not face himself as he truly is. But if prayer is to be anything at all, it must be the one place where all pretense falls away. It must be the one place where a man stops performing and simply stands as he is, no more, no less, before the one who has seen him from the beginning. Yet this is the very thing that many avoid. They will confess sins, but only the ones they have already made peace with. They will admit to faults, but only those that are respectable enough to be admitted. They will bring their weaknesses before God, but only those they are comfortable acknowledging. And so even in prayer they remain hidden. They bring a version of themselves, but not the real thing. They kneel in the presence of God, but their hearts remain veiled, even from themselves. But what folly is this? To attempt to hide from the one who sees all, to disguise the truth from him who knows it better than we do. It is one thing to be blind to oneself, it is another to deliberately turn away from the light when it is offered. For there is a strange paradox at work here. When a man refuses to be honest in prayer, he does not merely fail to deceive God, he fails to know himself. And that is the greatest tragedy of all. For how can he ask for help if he does not acknowledge his true need? How can he seek healing if he will not even admit that he is wounded? A man who will not remove his mask before God will never remove it before himself, and so he remains unchanged, not because God is unwilling to help, but because he has never truly asked. Honest prayer is not comfortable, it is not meant to be. It is a thing that exposes, that reveals, that lays bare the soul in all its frailty. It is not the careful selection of pious words, but the raw and unfiltered cry of a man who has at last stopped pretending. It is not the well-phrased confession of sin spoken with a sense of duty, but the desperate admission of guilt that can no longer be ignored. And though it may feel like an act of surrender, it is in fact the beginning of true freedom. For a man who has finally told the truth about himself is a man who is finally in a position to be helped. And what a relief it is once the mask is removed, for pretense is a heavy burden, and there is no greater exhaustion than maintaining an image that is not real. The man who prays honestly finds, often to his surprise, that God is not shocked by what he reveals. He is not repelled, nor does he recoil in disappointment. He knew it all along. The only difference is that now the man himself knows it too, and with that knowledge comes the first taste of what real transformation might look like. It is an odd thing that men fear to be honest with God, as though he might discover something about them he did not already know. But the real fear, if they admitted it, is not that God will reject them, but that they themselves will be forced to see the truth. For truth is a thing that demands action. A man who sees himself as he truly is cannot remain unchanged. He must either harden himself against what he has seen, or allow himself to be remade. And it is this, more than anything, that keeps so many from praying as they ought. It is not God's judgment they fear, but the realization that they can no longer continue as they are. But what is there to fear? If prayer is the place where one comes to be healed, why hesitate at the doorway? If it is the means by which one's burdens are lifted, why insist on carrying them a moment longer? There is no safety in self-deception, no security in hiding from the truth. A man may wear a mask before others, but let him at least take it off before God. Let him say, if nothing else, "Here I am, Lord. Not as I ought to be, not as I wish to be, but as I am. Take this heart full of fears and failings, and do with it as you will." For the prayer that begins in truth is the prayer that will end in transformation. And in the end, this is the only kind of prayer that matters. Not the polished words, not the outward reverence, not the carefully crafted petitions, but the prayer that strips away all illusions and leaves a man standing before God as he truly is. For only then can he be made into what he was always meant to be. When a man kneels to pray, he often forgets that he is entering into a reality far greater than his own. He comes as he is, small and finite, addressing one who is infinite and beyond all measure. And yet his prayers are so often shaped by the narrow scope of his own concerns. He prays for what he thinks he needs, for what he believes to be best, and he assumes, without question, that he understands his own condition well enough to know what he ought to ask for. But this is the very root of the problem. He does not see as he ought to see, and therefore he does not ask as he ought to ask. The man who prays without first seeking wisdom is like one who stumbles through a great palace in the dark, reaching out for treasures he cannot see, certain that he knows where they are, only to grasp at empty air. He believes he knows what is good for him, but his vision is limited, his knowledge incomplete. And so, when he prays, he asks for things that may do him no good at all. He asks for comfort, when what he truly needs is strength. He asks for an easy path, when the harder road would shape him into something greater. He asks for blessings that, if given, might lead him further from the one he prays to, rather than nearer. He assumes that his desires, simply because they are deeply felt, must also be right. But if a man is to pray rightly, he must first acknowledge his own blindness. He must recognize that he does not always know what is best for him. He must approach prayer not as one making demands, but as one seeking to be guided. For wisdom is not something he possesses by nature, it is something he must receive. And if he would ask for anything at all, let him first ask for this: the ability to see himself, his needs, and his life as they truly are. The folly of asking without wisdom is most evident in how men react when they do not receive what they have prayed for. They pray for success and receive failure. They pray for health and receive illness. They pray for deliverance from hardship and yet find themselves walking straight into the storm. And at once they begin to doubt. They question whether their prayers are heard, whether God has turned his face away, whether they have somehow been forgotten. But what they fail to see is that the very thing they lament may be the answer to their prayer, not the answer they expected, but the one they needed. A man who prays for patience cannot expect that patience will be handed to him like a coin placed in his palm. No, he will be given situations that test him, moments that stretch his endurance, trials that force him to wait when every impulse urges him to act. A man who prays for courage will not wake up the next morning feeling braver. He will find himself in circumstances that demand boldness, where he must choose between fear and faith. A man who prays for wisdom will not suddenly be filled with understanding. He will be placed in dilemmas where he must struggle, question, and learn. And yet, when these trials come, how often do men protest? They ask to be shaped, but they resist the shaping. They ask to be refined, but they shrink from the fire. They desire growth, but only if it does not come with pain. But growth without struggle is an illusion. A man cannot become strong without ever being tested. He cannot gain wisdom without ever being humbled. He cannot develop endurance without ever facing hardship. And so, if he prays for these things, but does not first ask for the wisdom to recognize when his prayers are being answered, he may well reject the very means by which he was to receive what he asked for. It is a curious thing that when a child asks for food, he does not always understand that the best nourishment may not be what he desires. He asks for sweets, yet he is given bitter medicine. He asks for ease, yet he is given discipline. And because he does not understand, he believes for a moment that he has been denied. But in time he comes to see that what he received was far better than what he requested. He constantly prayed. When he woke up weary, and so it is with prayer. A man who asks for what he desires without first seeking the wisdom to desire rightly will often believe he has been ignored, when, in truth, he has been given something far greater than he knew to ask for. If he is wise, he will learn to pray differently. He will not merely ask for what seems good in the moment, but for the eyes to see what is truly good. He will not merely plead for circumstances to change, but for the heart to endure them rightly. He will not insist on his own will, but will instead ask to be led, trusting that the one who sees all things will grant not what is most comfortable, but what is most needful. And this kind of prayer, the prayer that seeks wisdom first, is the only kind that can never truly fail. For the man who prays this way will always receive what he asks, for he is asking for the very thing that makes all other prayers right. The difference between the man who prays wisely and the one who prays foolishly is not that the wise man always receives what he desires, while the fool is left empty-handed. No, the difference is that when both receive the same answer, when both are given hardship instead of ease, difficulty instead of relief, the wise man will understand that his prayer has been answered. The wise man will take what he has been given and grow from it, while the fool will reject it and remain unchanged. And in the end, this is what determines the worth of a man's prayers. Not how many words he speaks, nor how passionately he asks, but whether he has first sought the wisdom to ask rightly. For a man who prays without wisdom is like one who drinks without first ensuring that the cup is filled with water rather than poison. But the man who prays with wisdom will find that, no matter what answer he receives, he has already been given the greatest gift of all, the ability to recognize that the answer is good. There is a peculiar contradiction at work in the heart of man when he approaches prayer. On the one hand, he longs to be heard, to pour out his needs, his fears, his desires before one who can grant him aid. And yet, at the very same time, he keeps a part of himself hidden. He comes with words but without surrender. He speaks of trust, but inwardly he resists. He wishes for divine help, but only on his own terms. He seeks comfort, not transformation. He wants God's answers, but he does not wish for them to come at the cost of his own will. This is no small matter, for prayer that is offered without surrender is not prayer at all. It is negotiation. It is an attempt to enlist divine power while retaining personal control. It is the man who says, "I will trust, but only if the answer aligns with my desires." And so he prays not with the spirit of a servant before his master, but with the attitude of a bargainer at a table, reluctant to give up what he still clings to. The root of this resistance is fear. There is a deep, unspoken terror in the thought of surrender, for it means yielding to something beyond oneself. It means no longer being in command, no longer dictating the terms. And what if, in surrendering, one loses something dear? What if the path that is chosen for him is one he would never have chosen for himself? What if the answer to his prayer is not comfort, but hardship, not gain, but loss? These are the fears that keep a man from surrendering in prayer. And yet, what he does not realize is that his reluctance does not safeguard him from suffering. It does not preserve him from hardship. It merely ensures that when hardship comes, as it surely will, he faces it alone, with hands still clutching at a control he never truly possessed. He has not prevented suffering. He has only deprived himself of the peace that comes from trust. For what is the alternative? If a man insists on his own will, what has he gained? He may believe that he knows what is best for him, but how often has he been wrong? How often has he pursued a thing he thought would bring happiness, only to find that it left him empty? How often has he resisted a thing he feared, only to discover later that it was the very thing he needed? If he is honest, he will admit that his own judgment is limited, that he does not always see clearly, that he has, time and again, misread his own life. And if this is true, then what sense is there in continuing to trust himself above all else? The truth is that surrender is not the loss of freedom, but the beginning of it. A man who clings to his own will is a man bound by his own limitations. He is confined to what he can see, to what he can understand, to what he can control. And because he is finite, because he is weak, because he is prone to error, his grasping for control does not give him safety, it only traps him in a cycle of frustration and fear. But the man who surrenders, who lays down his own will in prayer and truly means it, is the man who steps beyond those limits. He entrusts himself to one who sees further, who knows more, who understands what he cannot. And in that surrender, he is finally free. Free from the burden of having to figure everything out. Free from the restless anxiety of making things happen by his own strength. Free from the weight of trying to carry himself when he was never meant to. But surrender in prayer is not merely a single act. It is a daily, moment-by-moment offering of the heart. A man may believe he has surrendered, only to find the next time hardship comes that he is once again grasping for control. He may lay down his will today and take it back tomorrow. And so surrender is not something that is done once and then forgotten. It is a continual posture, a choice made again and again, until the soul no longer fights against it, but finds rest in it. Yet there is something even greater in surrender than peace. For when a man truly surrenders in prayer, he does not merely lay down his own will, he aligns himself with something far greater. He ceases to live as one who is trying to bend divine power to his own ends, and instead becomes one who is swept up into a greater purpose. His prayers cease to be demands, and instead become participation in something beyond himself. And though he may not always understand, though he may not always see the reasons behind what happens, he will know that he is no longer moving through life alone. He will know that his days, his struggles, his burdens are no longer his to carry alone. And this is the great paradox of surrender, that in giving up one gains, that in yielding one is lifted, that in ceasing to fight for control one finds that he is finally where he was meant to be. For the hands that receive most fully are the hands that are empty, and the heart that is most ready to be filled is the heart that has let go of everything else. A man who has learned this will never pray the same way again. He will no longer come to prayer as one who must convince, must plead, must strive for his own way. He will come instead with open hands, with an open heart, with a willingness to receive whatever is given, knowing that what is given is better than what he would have chosen for himself. He will no longer see surrender as loss, but as gain. He will no longer see trust as risk, but as the surest thing in the world. And in this he will find that prayer is no longer a place of struggle, but a place of rest. There is a strange assumption buried in the heart of many who pray. They come with words, with requests, with longings, poured out before the divine, and yet they believe in some hidden corner of themselves that they must persuade, that they must somehow convince the one who listens to them. They imagine, perhaps without realizing it, that they must present their case, argue their cause, and make themselves heard, as if the one to whom they speak were inattentive, or worse. And so prayer becomes for them not a meeting of trust, but a striving, an effort to secure what they fear might otherwise be denied. But what a misguided view this is! To approach prayer as though one must persuade is to forget who it is that listens. It is to imagine that the one who formed the heavens and the earth, who gave breath to man and holds the whole of existence in his hand, somehow needs convincing before he will act. But this is not the case. There is no reluctance in him that needs to be overcome, no hesitancy that must be met with pleading. If anything, it is the heart of man that hesitates, not the heart of the one who calls him to prayer. A child does not need to explain to his mother why he is hungry. He does not need to craft a well-argued case to justify his need for food. He simply asks, and the mother who loves him already knows what he needs. How much more, then, does the one who made all things already know what is necessary for those who pray to him? He is not ignorant of their needs, nor indifferent to them. He is not waiting to be convinced as if kindness were something that must be earned, and yet so many pray as though that were the case. If a man believes he must persuade, It is because he has not yet grasped the nature of the one to whom he prays. He still sees himself as a beggar before a distant ruler, rather than as a child speaking to a father who already loves him. He still imagines that prayer is a battle to win favor, rather than an act of trust in one who already seeks his good. And because he believes this, his prayers are filled with striving. He pleads as though divine generosity were limited, as though he might ask too much or too often. He measures his words, thinking that the right phrasing might increase his chances of being heard. He prays as though he is trying to move an unwilling heart, when in truth he is speaking to one who has already given more than he could ever deserve. The error in this thinking is not only that it misunderstands the nature of the one who listens, but that it also distorts the purpose of prayer itself. Prayer is not about bending divine will to human desire. It is not a tool for securing what one has already determined to be best. It is not a method of insistence, as though persistence alone might win the day. Rather, prayer is the place where a man aligns himself with what is already good. It is not about changing God's mind, but about changing the heart of the one who prays. There is something in man that resists this idea, for he prefers to believe that he knows what is best for himself. He comes with requests, with expectations, with a clear picture in his mind of what should be done, and when the answer does not come in the way he expects, he believes he has been denied. But he has not been denied. He has simply been given something different, something higher, something he would not have known to ask for. The difficulty is that, in his striving, he cannot yet see it. If a man would learn to pray rightly, he must first learn to trust. He must abandon the notion that he is the one directing the course of events, that his will is the one that must prevail. He must set aside his belief that prayer is a matter of insistence, of overcoming reluctance, and instead see it as an act of surrender. He must recognize that the one to whom he prays already knows his needs, already sees his burdens, already cares for him more deeply than he cares for himself. And when he does this, prayer ceases to be a struggle. It ceases to be an anxious striving, a desperate attempt to be heard. It becomes instead the most natural thing in the world, an act not of persuasion, but of resting in what is already true. And what relief there is in this! For a man who believes he must persuade is a man who carries a great burden. He fears that he must pray with enough intensity, with enough eloquence, with enough persistence, lest he be ignored. But the man who understands that he is already heard, already known, already loved, he is free from all of this. He does not pray anxiously but confidently. He does not measure his words, but speaks from the heart. He does not approach as one who must win favor, but as one who has already been welcomed. But let it not be mistaken, this does not mean that prayer is without effort. There is still perseverance, still times of waiting, still moments when the answer is not yet clear. But perseverance is not the same as persuasion. A man does not persist in prayer because he believes he must convince, but because he trusts. He continues not because he fears he will be ignored, but because he knows he will be heard. And in that trust he is changed. For in the end, the greatest gift of prayer is not that a man receives exactly what he asks for, but that in asking he is drawn closer to the one who gives. And the closer he comes, the less he strives. The more he trusts, the less he feels the need to persuade. The more he sees the truth, the more his heart is at rest. And this, in the end, is what prayer was always meant to be. Not a battle to secure what one desires, but the place where desire itself is transformed. not a means of forcing divine action, but a way of drawing nearer to the one who is already waiting. There is a curious tendency in the way men approach prayer. They come with words, with intentions, with well-formed sentences, and yet so often they leave unchanged. They have spoken, but they have not listened. They have expressed their desires, but they have not paused to receive. They have laid down their burdens, but they have not remained long enough to hear whether there is an answer. It is as if a man were to visit a wise and learned teacher, pour out all his concerns, and then, just as the teacher is about to respond, rush away, satisfied that he has spoken, but uninterested in what might be spoken to him in return. What a strange and ineffective way to converse. If one were to act in this way in any other relationship, it would be considered absurd. Imagine a man who seeks counsel from a trusted friend, who asks for advice, who pleads for wisdom, and then, before his friend has uttered a word, turns on his heel and leaves. He would be no wiser than when he arrived, for he did not remain to listen. And yet, this is precisely what many do when they pray. They treat prayer as a monologue, an act of speaking into the silence, rather than as a conversation in which listening is just as vital as speaking. It is not that they doubt that answers exist, but that they do not know how to wait for them. They expect, perhaps, that any response will come in a grand and unmistakable moment, lightning from the sky, an audible voice from above, a sudden and overwhelming certainty. But if that were the only way to receive an answer, how few would ever truly hear? For the voice they seek does not often come in thunder, but in stillness. It does not force itself upon them, but waits to be heard. And so, those who do not know how to be silent before it, who do not know how to listen, who do not know how to remain, will always struggle to hear what is being spoken to them. The difficulty is not that answers are absent, but that men are too restless to receive them. They are accustomed to noise, to movement, to distraction. They expect immediacy, as if divine wisdom should operate on their timetable, and when an answer does not arrive in the manner or speed they expect, they assume it has not arrived at all. But it is not that they have been denied. It is that they have not waited long enough to hear. They have spoken, and then they have turned away, not realizing that what they sought was already being given. There is a deep kind of listening that must be learned if one is to pray rightly. It is not the passive kind, the mere absence of speech, but the active kind, the kind that leans in, that expects to hear, that watches attentively. It is the listening of a servant awaiting instruction, of a student before his master, of one who knows that the words he is waiting for are more important than anything he might say himself. It is a listening that requires patience, for it does not force an answer, but receives it when it is given. And this is where so many fail. They cannot bear to wait. They grow uncomfortable in the silence, and so they fill it with their own words, their own thoughts, their own distractions. They would rather talk endlessly than be still. They would rather speculate than wait for wisdom. They would rather move forward blindly than pause long enough to see where they are being led. But if a man would truly learn to pray, he must also learn to listen. He must enter into prayer not merely to speak, but to receive. He must be willing to set aside his own agenda, his own expectations, his own demands, and simply be present. He must resist the impulse to hurry, to rush through his petitions and move on to the next task. He must linger in the silence, knowing that it is not emptiness, but fullness that he has not yet learned to perceive. And what a transformation this brings! For a man who learns to listen in prayer does not merely receive answers. He is changed by the act itself. In listening, he begins to recognize that prayer is not just about asking for things, but about being drawn into something greater. He sees that it is not about presenting a list of desires, but about aligning his heart with the one who already knows what he needs. He realizes that prayer is not merely a means of seeking divine intervention, but a way of deepening relationship. And the more he listens, the more he begins to hear, not in the ways he expected, perhaps, but in ways that are truer, deeper, more lasting. And yet, how few ever reach this point. How many continue to pray as if they must do all the speaking, as if silence were a void rather than a gift. They wonder why they do not hear, not realizing that it is they who have not listened. They wonder why their prayers feel one-sided, not realizing that they have not given time for a response. They lament that they feel distant, that they do not sense guidance, that they do not receive clarity, all the while ignoring the simple truth that these things do not come to those who rush past them. They come to those who remain, to those who wait, to those who are willing to let prayer be not merely an act of expression, but an act of reception. If a man would know what it is to pray, he must learn what it is to listen. If he would seek answers, he must learn to wait for them. If he would deepen his understanding, he must first quiet himself enough to hear. And in doing so, he will find that the voice he longed for was never absent. It was only waiting for him to be still enough to perceive it. If there is one truth that must be grasped above all in the matter of prayer, it is this: prayer is not a performance, nor a transaction, nor an effort to win divine favor. It is not a mere recitation of words, nor a means of manipulating outcomes, nor a practice undertaken to fulfill a duty and be done with it. Prayer is, at its heart, the drawing near of the creature to the Creator, the communion of the finite with the infinite, the conversation of the dependent with the one who holds all things in his hand. And yet how often do men approach it as though it were something else entirely? How often do they rush in without preparation, without awareness of whom they are addressing? How often do they speak as if their words must persuade an unwilling ear, not realizing that they are heard before they even begin? How often do they present their requests but fail to trust, to surrender, to accept that what is given is better than what they had planned for themselves? How often do they fill the silence with their own voices and then complain that no answer was given? But prayer, rightly understood, is never a burden, never a mere obligation, never a practice to be endured. It is not an empty habit, nor a lifeless formality, nor an exercise in futility. It is the soul's highest privilege, the heart's greatest necessity, the means by which man is drawn out of his own narrow self and into the reality of something far greater than himself. It is the place where the restless heart finds peace, where the anxious mind finds clarity, where the striving will learns to surrender. And when a man learns to pray as he ought, to prepare his heart before he speaks, to approach with humility and awe, to trust rather than strive, to surrender rather than insist, to seek not just answers but transformation, to listen as much as he speaks, then he will find that prayer is not merely something he does, but something that does a work in him. He will see that it is not a one-sided monologue, but an invitation into relationship. He will come to understand that it is not an act of pleading before a reluctant giver, but a moment of resting in the presence of one who has already given far more than he could ever ask. And what joy, what peace, what strength there is for the man who prays in this way. He will not be shaken by the uncertainties of life, for he knows that he does not carry them alone. He will not be consumed by fear, for he has learned to trust the one who holds his future. He will not feel abandoned, for he knows that he is always heard. And most of all, he will not leave prayer unchanged, for he has learned that in drawing near, he is not merely seeking something, he is being shaped into someone new.